Good evening. Welcome to our March 3rd School Board Work Session. The time is now 5:30 p.m. The school board would like to take this moment to respectfully acknowledge we are residing on the traditional land of the Dene people. Our mission is to provide an excellent, equitable education in a safe, supportive environment so all students will succeed and contribute to a diverse and changing society. Mrs. Richardson, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Burgess is expected on Zoom. Miss Carol Hubbard.
Here.
Mr. Doran is expected. Miss Julian.
Here.
Miss Maple.
Here.
Mrs. Hardy.
Here.
Mrs. Burnett.
Here.
Thank you.
We will move on into our work session for our proposed budget work. Tonight, as mentioned, board members, in the email on Friday that I had sent, a decent amount of time tonight I would like to spend discussing the potential of a charter school being added into our district with Pearl Creek. We have three potential paths forward. I hope everyone had time to consider these options over the weekend so we can have a productive discussion this evening. For the listening public and to remind the board, our three paths forward for the Pearl Creek Charter are: we can follow our existing charter policy and adhere to the established timeline. We can fast track the process by considering the charter application outside of our adopted policy, or we can establish and budget for a Pearl Creek magnet program for FY26. I would like us to have a real honest conversation in hopes of developing a consensus to move forward with for us as a board and for administration. Once we have a consensus, if time allows, we can continue on through with the Budget Act and the Balancing Act tool, and making sure that anything else that you would like added into the Balancing Act tonight can get added in for our next work session. So with that, I will turn it over to us board members. I know last time I kind of went in a circle. I'll start off tonight with my thoughts in this process, and then we can just go by hands. Whoever would like to go next can go next. If we can just kind of speak our thoughts and then go from there. So for my thoughts, I have a lot of them. One, I'm not in favor of bypassing our policies. I'm also not in favor of fast tracking the application, and I know that I had said I was, and initially when I had made those comments, I did not fully grasp the implications of doing so on our current budget deficit and what we're doing. I also want to ensure that we're following policies, because I myself feel that if we are not adhering to our policies, if we're bypassing them, then we're setting a dangerous precedent. That said, this is where my mixed feelings come in. On one hand, we underwent an intensive and very difficult school consolidation process. The majority of us have spent the last year on this. And consolidating our schools was a response to our declining enrollment as well as our deficits that we're facing. And so to reverse course, I feel we're contradicting the work we have done. However, and this is where I have been in my head with this for weeks now. If the board is inclined to want to move forward with a charter, I would really strongly encourage us to revisit the magnet instead of the charter. That's where I'm at. If this board would strongly consider and wants to open the charter, I would ask that we reconsider the magnet. And I know that goes against everything I just said, and this is where my head has been for weeks now. Should I have listened a little better beforehand? Absolutely. We are all board members here that try to do the best we can with the information at hand. And if there is a chance that we could see a potential increase in students, I do feel that would be with the magnet. And so if there were to be a decision made in that stance, that's where I would like to see it, so that we can actually see the effects of an enrollment incline inside the district. Whereas if it was with a charter school, it would ultimately cost us financially. And so that's just kind of where my thoughts are with it. And I saw Mrs. Julian's hand up. So we'll go Mrs. Julian, and then Mrs. Hardy, was that a hand?
Do you want me to just address the Pearl Creek Charter? Is that what you want me to talk about right now?
We're addressing charters, yes. That's the one that has the application. That's the one that we need to
Sure.
talk about, because that's the one that has,
Sure. Right now, I don't feel like either the budget that's been put forth in the budget book from with the charter application. I feel like there's a lot of things that need to be updated in that budget scenario. As well as I don't feel like we have in front of us as a viable enough detail of what is behind the projected costs for adding a charter. So for me to even consider this, I need more numbers. I need to know an updated projections on where is the charter school at 500 and 502 or 520 some students. What are the assumptions that are built in? What are and I met yesterday with two of the folks from the committee that's standing it up, and it was a really good time to really look through those budget scenarios. I encourage them to put forth different scenarios based on a BSA that increases by 680, that then all that funding would go to a charter, versus one that gets one-time funds based on what administration has put forth and on only having a certain amount go through of those one-time funds. These are real budget implications that we need to consider before I'm ready to make any decision. But I'm confident that if we hear this within 60 days, and if we make if this board wants to move forward with looking at considering the budget or considering a charter application outside of our normal time frame and waiving our own policy, if we move forward with that, at that point, I'd need to see much more details, not only of what it costs us, but also the assumptions that are built in. And a lot of those assumptions, you mentioned new students. And I mentioned this I spoke to this yesterday. Does a new opportunity, a new school have the potential to bring in new students? Sure, absolutely. It also has the potential to exacerbate some of our vacancy problems that we have right now with educators overall. So this came up at the budget meeting from one of the principals who sits on the budget committee. And I'd like to state what that person said, because it really resonated with me for the first time, which was that we don't just have a budget problem, we also don't have enough teachers to fill the vacancies that we have, the positions that we have right now. And that's also what we saw in the beginning of the school year, which was driving up some class sizes in elementary up over 30. So there's a lot of things that we need to consider should we make that decision. And I feel like it would be incredibly fiscally irresponsible, and also irresponsible for considering the enrollment that we have as a district, as well as our vacancies and just the job pool of educators, to not to consider that without considering closing another school, a neighborhood school. If we're going to add back a school, I would feel very uncomfortable not then doing what we know we need to do in looking at another school to put on the blocks right now. And that's, I think, the only way that I would feel like that's a responsible thing for us to do. If we move forward with adjusting going outside of our time frame, I really think I would advocate that we then address our own policies to reflect that of the statute, because we cannot just make an exception this one time. We have to be consistent and fair. So if we're going to address it outside the time frame, I would recommend that we just change our policy overall, our board policy that says that within 60 days and follows exactly what that statute says. Because if we don't do that, we are not being fair and equitable to all. And I'm very concerned about that. So those are the concerns that I have. I do think that it is really important, though, that we look at the proposal as it's been put forth. The other thing that feels a little disingenuous, though, is that if we were to, as this board, consider a magnet, that's not what the community's asking for right now. On the 5th of February, a full intent to charter was put forward, and then a full charter application was put forward. So it feels disingenuous for this board to then say, no, we don't want that, we'll go back to this magnet, when the community who's driving this is not saying that. So I'd want to hear that from the community before we consider that third option.
Thank you, Mrs. Julian. Mrs. Hardy?
Yeah. So last week in people's closing comments, they talked about how important listening to legal advice is. We received some actual legal advice that came from the appropriate channels. John Cedar said he recommends acting on the charter application within a 60-day time frame, as there's no definitive ruling on whether our district policy conflicts with state statute. He noted that our current policy predates the latest state statute updates, making it unclear how the state interprets the statute's first line: a local school board shall prescribe an application procedure for establishing a charter in that school district. It was pretty clear and definitive that we have 60 days. So we don't have two choices. It's not our policies. If our policies conflict with state statutes, state statute beats our policies. We have two choices. We can consider a charter within a 60-day timeline, actually listening to legal advice, which board members seem to think they should do. I would tend to agree. Or we could see if the Pearl Creek community would be willing to go back to looking at a magnet school. But as Ms. Julian pointed out, we should be doing that with them, not to them or for them. It has been incredibly frustrating sitting on this board and watching board members pretty much summarily dismiss the voices of an entire community. And I'm frustrated at this point. I could say some things that would embarrass a few of you at this table, but I'll save you from that. We need to do better. You need to start listening to your community. You need to start acting in good faith. That's how this presentation was brought to us, and kudos to the Pearl Creek community for being stand-up citizens and not going low.
Point of order. I would like to ask that we all speak with respect of one another. We've all been elected to make decisions together, and there's no need for any of us to be disparaging anybody else. We've all been listening. We've all been doing our due diligence, and coming to different conclusions does not mean that anybody is ignoring anybody. I'm eager to have this conversation tonight publicly, and I want to do it respectfully.
Thank you, Ms. Maple. Would there be any comments from the board? Mr. Burgess? I know he's on Zoom.
I did not have a hand raised.
Okay.
But sure, I can speak. I am not in favor of waiving our existing policies at this point in time. Others have already spoken. You know, I agree with much of what Ms. Julian said. We made a decision to close a school. We made that for a couple reasons, financial reasons being the primary one. We have an incredible deficit to balance. And I think that at this point, we need to be moving forward. We have a lot of other issues to deal with. I do think that we have listened. We made a decision as a board to close a school. I understand why some people are upset about that or disagree with that decision. But I stand by my vote. I think we did what is best for the district as a whole. And that opening a charter school now would have serious budget implications that would harm the rest of the district. I understand we're talking about reviewing an application, and you know, if maybe I missed the email or something with a legal opinion, but if it is a legal opinion that we push it forward, then fine. We should do what our attorneys advise, but absent that being a legal requirement, I think that we have an existing policy, and we should follow it. I can't see, you know, the other challenge with fast tracking an application is that means that the application isn't as polished as it could be. So does that decrease the chances of us accepting it even more? I don't know. Does it set the school up for challenges as it opens? You know, I would assume it does. I am, you know, frankly, it's frustrating to hear members of the community claiming that we're not listening. With the number of hours I've put into personal conversations, reading emails, advocating down in Juneau, defending against personal attacks on this board. I'm involved in this community. We are all involved. We are all listening. We are doing our jobs. And people are welcome to disagree with the decisions we make. But once we make a decision, we should move forward. Not talk about reversing the decision, not talk about, no, I mean, okay. And that's, I guess that's more of a comment on the magnet model. If we're reversing a decision, we'd be, you know, I would say that if I would rather have a magnet than a charter, but I don't appreciate the way that we're coming about this here. The board has made a decision. I think that it sets a poor precedent for us to be reversing decisions. I think it sets a poor precedent for us to be opening a charter school in response to a school closure rather than that charter school being opened for a specific community need. There is a difference. That's where I stand right now. And I appreciate Ms. Maple's request to keep this meeting respectful, both of the community and of one another. I also resent any implications that we're not listening or that we're not understanding the information. We do a lot of work on this board. And frankly, it's exhausting. And I guess, yeah, I will leave it there. I'm opposed to fast tracking this. And that's where I stand.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Meinert as he can speak to the legal advice as well as word from the commissioner's office.
Yeah, thank you. I think Ms. Hardy captured the legal advice we received. That was prior to the conversation I had with Commissioner Bishop. I think it's important for the table and the public to understand Commissioner Bishop wasn't sure how our policy corresponds with state statute. So she is working with the Department of Law to get us what the state stance would be, because it is very clear on that first line of the statute, that the statute asks school districts to create a procedure for application of a charter school, which the district has done through policy, and that creates a tight framework in terms of when we accept charter policies. Mr. Sedor did say it is reasonable for school districts to put guardrails in place for when charter applications are accepted. But it's just that the state statute hasn't been interpreted by the state nor challenged. And so that's where we find ourselves now, is that oftentimes charter applications do come at the beginning of the year or come within districts' frameworks, and so this is a bit outside of that process, and so that's where we find the challenges today. And so I'm hopeful that Commissioner Bishop will get back to me this week. She was hopeful that she'd be able to give me some direction by the end of the week, and as soon as I have that, I would get that out to the board.
Thank you, Dr. Minor. More conversation from the board. Mr. Doran?
Okay, first, I want to apologize for being a few minutes late. My car died, and I had to switch cars, figure that out. So just so I know, I think I have a sense of the question, but could you repeat the question that was before the board for conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. We are discussing the matter at hand, which is the Pearl Creek Charter that has come forward, the application. With the email that I sent out on Friday, I'm just asking board members to kind of address their thoughts, opinions, feelings, and kind of where they stand so we can develop a consensus for the way forward.
Thank you. So my comments in terms of it is, I am glad we're having the conversation. We brought it up a week ago. The things have changed over the last course of the month, course of several weeks. And I guess I'm less concerned at the moment of whether we're going to, so I'm not discussing whether I would approve for the approval of the charter, but what is before is, which is budget pieces, but directly related. As I mentioned last week, we have a dilemma. We have to factor this into our budget. We do have a charter application in front of us. The deadline has never concerned me because we can waive policy. Policy is our guidelines, and we can waive it with cause, if you want, with reason. But what I'm concerned about, but I'm glad to see the conversation is we have had, beyond the money, we have a cadre, a broad cadre of community members who the phrase that has often come up over the last couple of months is problem solve. I think when we put school consolidation on the table, we put it out there so we could hear from our community and then weigh those things. I want to be real clear that I think everybody is on this board and everybody who has testified and working on this are coming from a good intent. And I think, yes, we weigh things out and we look at it. But I also recognize that we can change our minds. I changed my mind last spring on a board decision. As I thought about it and looked at the pros and cons, and even though what I was looking at, I was looking at it in one lens, but when I looked at the broader lens, it made absolute sense. And I mean, it's public. I changed my mind on having F&A advisory member. On one hand, no, but as I said then and changed my mind, it's a much broader issue. I think that's what we have here, also a much broader issue. I've also been on this board when then the board has changed their minds. And sometimes that's important. And long before I was on the board, things have come back where a decision has been changed. So I'm hopeful that we can provide a give and take, community, ourselves, or district, in looking at those bigger pictures, or looking at the big picture. I don't want, because I think that's what everybody's trying to do. We're trying to look at, there are ripple effects no matter what we decide. Sometimes we know them beforehand and sometimes we don't. And this is one of those situations that there are a lot of ripple effects. We're going to deal with a money adjustment to our budget, probably one way or another, for this coming year. So we have to prep for that. I hope, though, in the conversation that it's not just an either or that, but that it is a coming together. So, magnet was put on the table here. I don't care what the name is, and I hope we don't get caught up. And we actually talked about this last week. What is a magnet? It can be whatever we decide as a district. We have had a certain model of what a magnet is, but that doesn't mean that it has to be. And when you look at magnets around the country, they are all over the board. Is there something along this line, or that we can really talk about, because we have a community in turmoil? And I'm not just talking about Pearl Creek. This is broader. There are ripple effects mentioned. Maybe we need to look at other buildings. Maybe, this is not a, maybe it is reinstating a neighborhood school. Maybe it is doing a focus or a magnet or whatever we want to use, something there. Is there a give and take on all sides? If we basically made a decision as a board, the community heard that decision and they took it where they felt they needed to go. Can we look at ways that on all sides we have room to talk? We have room to problem solve. And that's what I'm hopeful that we can get to, without, and it's not a matter of somebody being right or wrong, or egg on the face or something of, gee, I don't get what I said. But can we broaden it out and look at what's good for our kids, our community, and have that conversation? So I'm really glad that it's here, but I think it's a bigger conversation than just charter. No, it's what do we do with our budget? We made a decision based on best information that was there. The board made a decision. We have new information. Revisiting that decision is not out of line in any way, and whatever it is going forward, I mean, we'll have to make some decisions around that. But now that that guided the administration putting a budget together, but we're now in the budget and trying to decide what's there. We've put things on the budget, and I'll wrap up with here, so I'll pause, so put me back in the key. But just, we've put a lot of different ideas on the table once we got the proposed budget. We'll be talking about bits and pieces. This is one of them that I think really needs to be there, and I do really hope that it's done in a spirit of that as we think, we look at all the different factors, and on all sides that we can come together collaboratively and productively. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Mr. Doran. Ms. Maple.
I just wanted to speak specifically to something Mr. Dorn just said, the charter versus magnet, and I understand your point. And also wanted to say that for me, the reason that I wanted to talk about these things, in the context of one another, is that the cost of a magnet school is something that, if we're talking about options, whether it's one that we have a better grasp on what the cost would be, as opposed to a charter school. I mean, they both have a series of unknowns, but that was why that's why I wanted a magnet school to be a part of this conversation, because I ultimately don't think that I agree with Mr. Burgess that I don't think right now we should even be talking about this, because we did cast a vote. And I would like to stand by that vote. However, it's where we are, and I understand why we're having this conversation, and I do want to honor that. And so, when I'm looking at the options before us, to stay the course and follow our policy, and so I guess I'll elaborate on how I see those three options. Is that if we stay the course following our policy, we don't know how the state will proceed. We don't know that, we don't know what the state's legal take on how the statute interacts with our policy is. So yes, in not hearing the application, I see that there is a risk there then, that could be seen as us declining, and then the state could decide to hear it instead of us, as I understand. That's a potential. There's also the potential that the state recognizes our policy and lets us honor our policy and hear it at the normal time when we've passed our budget and can give it our full attention. And I understand that if we were to fast track, we would need, that either of those scenarios, if it's the most fiscally responsible decision to say we already made these decisions, that we already made the fiscally responsible decisions, and we want to budget based off those decisions we made, that we do have to know that there is a risk that we are taking, that in either of those scenarios, the state Board of Education could theoretically override us. It doesn't mean they will, but that is a potential. Which is, I think, why having the conversation about the magnet school becomes relevant, because these are all just different options with a different amount of risk and with a different budget that we need to build based off the risk we decide to take. I feel like I'm kind of talking in circles, but I hope that clarifies something of where I am, of trying to look at all of the risk associated with any one of these decisions and make the one that I think is the most responsible, while also saying I think we did, like Mr. Burgess said, I think we did make the decision that was the most responsible. And so that makes this conversation really frustrating, that we're back in this place of talking about what we're going to do, even though we set a path forward. And I don't say that to say we shouldn't be talking about it. I fully understand why we're here. Yeah, I'll stop. I won't talk in any more circles.
Thank you, Ms. Maple. Dr. Minor.
Thank you. The other large wrinkle I just want on the table and publicly said as well, and the board to consider, is the facility of Pearl Creek. And so that's not something that the board has talked a lot about, but for Pearl Creek to put in a finalized application, they have to have a lease with the school district if they want Pearl Creek facility. We haven't had those detailed conversations with Pearl Creek Charter on a lease, because I haven't received direction from the board if that's something we want to entertain. It certainly would be challenging for the district to close the neighborhood school at the end of May and then flip the facility for a charter school at the beginning of August to start. It's not like a neighborhood school or a magnet school, because if we are leasing the facility, it's likely that most of the infrastructure would come out of the school. When charters go into facilities, they bring or purchase their own equipment and resources and take it with them. And so want that to be a conversation for the board. So, even if the district doesn't hear the charter, which that's what I'm starting to hear from board members, the Pearl Creek charter would not have a complete application without a lease in place with somebody. It doesn't have to be us, but if they want to use the Pearl Creek facility, we would need to work on a lease agreement with them. So as you're thinking about all the wrinkles to this application and the way that we want to go, I would like the board to consider that as well.
Thank you, Dr. Minor. We've got Miss Carol Hubbard, Miss Julian, and then Mrs. Hardy.
Oops, thank you. At the risk of sort of repeating what everybody has already said, I'll just keep my thoughts kind of simple and concise. I do not support the idea of fast tracking the application. I don't know that we have time, and it seems like it's a disservice almost to the charter to sort of slam something together for them. And like Mr. Meinert said, then we have to flip the school, and it just doesn't seem like it's at the right time, and the timing is poor, and our financial situation is poor. So it just feels like it's just not the right time to do all of this. And I would like to stand by what we decided and move forward. I feel like if we add $500,000 back into our budget, then the PTR is what's going to go up and even higher. We already have, a proposal to increase PTR by 2.5 from K through 12. And so while we're doing something that appears to be good for one group of kids, the kids that are paying for it are the children in the rest of the schools. And we don't impact a charter's PTR. We only impact all the other schools in the district. And so I'm not a fan of that. I will not support that. I don't even like raising the PTR by the 2.5 that's already been proposed. So I'm like wanting to throw anything at it to not have to raise the especially K1, 2, and 3. I was reading through the state board, I guess it's the strategic priority of DEED, and they said to support all students to read at grade level by the end of 3rd grade. And I thought, okay, how are we going to do that if we're ballooning these classes out for K1, 2, 3s? And I would even like to see us looking at dividing up K5, PTR. We had it just elementary and then middle and then high school. And I'd even like to break that down a little bit more. So we did have a K3 block and a 4-5 block in the elementary level. Mr. DeGraw, sorry for throwing that in there. Just so we could have another option, because I think that's really important, but I do not want to see the rest of the district kids pay for us now having a larger budget to maneuver because we're trying to push something that just doesn't feel like it has enough time. And I don't think the board has enough time. I'm not 100% sure, but it feels like it's very pressed. I know it's disappointing, and I feel, I'm feeling like a heel for saying it, because if I had my magic wand, I'd just put the pile of gold in the middle of the room and we could just give everybody everything, but we don't have it. So I know we closed schools because of lower enrollment and financial constraints. And it's kind of just, I come back to the finances. And we just don't have the money to add more to an already oversized budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Carol Hubbard. We'll go to Miss Julian, then we have Mrs. Hardy, Mr. Dorn, and then Mr. Burgess.
Okay, thank you. I will be clear that I am in favor of following what our legal advice was. However, if there's differing advice that comes from DEED that says that, they recognize our policies, I'd like to maybe perhaps have the district do a follow-up with our legal counsel just to verify that, but I would be inclined to follow what recommendation is from legal. However, I also am not in favor of making an exception for one. So if we're going to move forward with making an exception, I feel like we need to address our board policy at the same time. That's the only way to make it fair for everybody moving forward, and to also mitigate our risks and liability for a potential lawsuit from somebody else if we open ourselves up to, as Mr. Dorn said, to change our minds. It isn't within our authority, but we're talking about a policy here on a timeline of when we see charter applications. That was October 1st of 2024. That's been severely missed. It's not just by a day or two. It's been severely missed, right? And so I just feel like if we're going to make this exception, we have to address our policy. But I would be in favor of going with what our legal counsel says. I, as a parent who attends Pearl Creek, and also somebody who has been asking the question, why can't we talk about a magnet anywhere else except Pearl Creek? I have thought a lot about this. What is a magnet? What would a magnet be there? I've looked at Barnett. Right now, our magnets don't have, to make a magnet really cost effective, and also to make a school of choice that, or I should say a magnet that has a walking zone. And I know that right now the Pearl Creek community is looking at increasing their target PTR to 24, as well as including some sort of walking zone. If you put any type of school of choice with a walking zone in that neighborhood, you are only going to grab a certain amount of kids because the houses are just more spread out. We see that right now with Pearl Creek as a neighborhood school, having a walk zone of, I think it's less than 50. If you put a school of choice in a place that has more condensed neighborhoods, you will be able to grab more students within that walking zone and make it more cost efficient. If you put a magnet or a school of choice in a place that has more, a lower economic household incomes, you're going to potentially serve students that may not have the same opportunities. So these are things that we should consider and that I've considered very deeply. I'm just going to talk about magnet versus charter. The difference between a magnet and a charter is that with the magnet, we still, as this board, maintain some control. We also, the difference with the charter is that they're in control with their APC. They're standing it up. I do think that if we were at all in the future to consider adding a charter, or looking at that facility in particular, a charter makes more sense to me if we can't afford a neighborhood school, because it doesn't really make sense to have a walk zone. It seems like the magnet wouldn't even really work because the walk zone would be so tiny anyway. That's why I think a charter, just making everybody have to drive there, or if they can provide their own private transportation, that's really the reality that we'd be looking at in that school, whether it's a charter or whether it's a magnet. And I think that we try, and that's a real kind of sticking point has been for me. How do we make it more accessible? Well, I don't know if we can actually do it with that magnet there in that location. And that's why I've thought, well, a charter would make more sense. If we as a board decide to move forward with that. These are the things that I've been, really considering deeply. And that's why I also would rather us either look at the charter or not look at the charter, not really talk about a magnet in that location. However, I do think that we need to talk about magnets, and I'm listening to Dr. Meinert and saying, when you said we're not going to talk about it for this next year, but we are going to look to that for the future. So I'm going to hold everybody to that, because we need to look at magnets or focuses or whatever Mr. Dorn is talking about. How do we define that elsewhere so that we can show innovation where it's happening in our neighborhood schools? I am more in favor of a magnet in a location that is more accessible, that gives more families more opportunities. But I want to end with saying one thing, which is a huge assumption. It's an assumption based on when I looked through the charter application, it's an assumption that we've heard in the community. And that is the only way to bring, this is the assumption, the only way to bring back out of district students is by opening up another school of choice. And I say maybe. I think that the more likely thing is if we invest, and we heard this from the budget committee, there was a support for this. If we invest in our best program, there is more of a likelihood of increasing out of district correspondence students. For
Mrs.
that.
Dillian, I hear you. We're talking about the charters right now, so let's go
Okay.
back to that. I hear you though.
But I do want to address that assumption because it's baked in. And that's why looking at the assumptions and naming those assumptions are really important. The other thing that this charter model has assumed is that all of the students, almost all of the students who attend Pearl Creek right now would automatically apply. And that's part of that 526 student enrollment. I think that's in the charter application. However, I was able to talk through that with community members who are part of that yesterday. And I recommended that they look at ridership on buses and assume that they're probably going to lose most of that ridership to neighborhood schools that they would be redistricted to. Because if a family's already dependent on transportation to get them to Pearl Creek, I would highly recommend that they don't assume that that family is now going to be able to drive them to and from a school, and or that the charter would be able to provide transportation very quickly. So I'm skeptical, and again, I'm skeptical about the size that has been put forward, whether or not that's truly viable at like over a 500 student charter. I think that as this board, and I asked the committee members to look at this, the APC group to look at this yesterday, to give us an idea of what's the actual, if they do want to do a neighborhood, okay, fine. What is that neighborhood area? What would be that preference area? And how much would be an ongoing, potentially open enrollment or a lottery? How many students are we looking at? Because again, it's a lottery. It could, if it's an equal lottery, and we know that we cannot prioritize out of district families to enroll, we don't really know how many students are going to get pulled from neighborhood schools, how many students might get pulled from out of district, how many students might get, so we don't really know. And again, I really lean on that lottery, because just as much as it could bring in a whole bunch of new students, it also could pull from neighborhood schools, which would then exacerbate also our enrollment. And I also want to, again, say that the staffing is super important to consider, because we would be adding additional teaching positions as we're looking at reducing teaching positions district-wide.
Thank you, Mrs. Julian. Mrs. Hardy.
The end of January, I had one of my regular meetings with Dr. Meinert, and I started it off with, first, I don't actually think this is a workable idea. And that was about the Pearl Creek magnet model. I didn't, absolutely didn't. But for the sake of it, can we run it through its paces? I feel like we're going to lose people who would normally be understanding of our position if we don't show a good faith effort. And so we did. We sat in that meeting and we ran it through its paces. And in doing that, that's where we're like, well, what if they did fill 140 students? What if they did do this? I don't know. I don't have the answers. Let's ask them. And so they did a survey. And so they did community outreach. And they did our work for us. And they found people to buy into the idea. And then they got those people to show up. They got those people to email. They got those people to give us their names. And then they transparently shared all of that information with us. Here are their names. Here are their emails. Here's the people that we're talking to. They were transparent 100% through the process. I did not start out. I started out being, it doesn't help our budget. There's no way this can work. But I engaged in the process. And I know from talking to many of these advocates for Pearl Creek and people who weren't for it, that not many other board members did that. So while you can say you're listening, I don't need to go into it. It doesn't feel that way to a lot of other people.
Point of order, just
I'll move
Keeping-
on. I am. But if we all get to address me, I get to address you too. Later on at one of our work sessions, I did the research. I went to the library and I looked up, well, how did the last magnet school start? How did all of this happen? And there was a quote that stuck with me from Bob Coghill, a former board member. And it was, the district should not choose to do something just because it's politically popular, nor should it choose to do something that's so unpopular it is destined to fail. And the thing is, closing Pearl Creek was so unpopular, it was destined to fail. People are not movable widgets. We don't get to choose how they respond to what we do, but they told us what they were going to do. They told us, we don't like your plan. We're not going to listen to your plan. We're going to come up with our own plan. They have an entire homeschool group built out on Facebook right now, and it is not homeschooling through best. These are people who are generally understandable and some of our biggest allies, and we are turning them into some of our biggest adversaries. It doesn't make any sense. They offered to bring more students back to our district. They offered to work with us. And then we put out a strategy that was doomed to fail. And it did. And they did exactly what they said they were going to do. They had a charter into us in record time. And I know I read through that charter. It's a good charter. I've seen the other charters that have been approved over the years. This one is as good, if not better. So it's not a rush job. It was the work of many hours of some very intelligent people. It's well done. I had some questions about some of the finances where I was like, ooh, I don't actually know that that's right. I don't actually know that what they're doing, they think they're doing right. And so I texted one of the members who I knew was in charge of the finances. And I was like, hey, can we meet? Because I want to talk about this budget. I don't know that it's right. And she came and we met at the library and we talked it through. And I said, well, what about this? And what don't you know about this? And she answered my questions. And they did. She had great resources. She's a professional grant writer. She knows what she's doing. And not only that, but they've asked me questions. And then I've gone and done research. Do you know that we have a transportation policy 3540? And in that policy, it clearly states the district shall provide transportation services to students enrolled in those charter schools seeking transportation services on a space available basis along regular routes that students attending schools and attendance areas in our district are transported. Students may be transported via regular routes. It's in our own policy. It's their state policy too, both state statute and administrative code that says you have to provide transportation along your regular routes if there's space. And if we're busing kids past Pearl Creek to Ann Ween, there's gonna be space. We don't even know our own policies well enough. We just keep saying, this won't work, I won't engage. And then you wonder why people are frustrated. There's a thing about a lease, but it says state and state statute that we have to offer them a lease. We don't get a choice whether or not we offer them a lease. We might not have to offer it until we've cleared out a building, and that is definitely up to us and how long we do it, but we don't get a choice not to offer them a lease. And I've also spent the time talking to these people, and they're at this point like, if it's not Pearl Creek, you know what? We'll find a different place. We'll lease a different building because we've pushed them to that point.
Mr. Doran.
I'm going to hitchhike on some of Ms. Hardy's comments, and a lot of them I agree with because we have to come to the question about the charter approval. We have received a charter. I will support our reviewing that charter if that is the case. We have legal advice for that. We have written indication from the department, from the Commissioner of Education, that she would recommend it on to the state board. We have a governor who wants more charters, who has appointed every single state board member and expects them to do what he wants. That's clear. So if it goes that way, we will, it can be appealed. The state board is the one who makes the decision. Whether we approve it or disapprove it, they're the ones who make the decision. So I think it's a reality that we're going to have. And I want to make it real clear, the charter application, the people who put it forward did not miss a deadline. It is outside our timeline, but they didn't miss the deadline. They didn't know that it was even needed to go charter. So with that said, again, I want to bring us to hopefully looking at one of the issues that Dr. Minor brought up is building use. We don't know what we're doing with our buildings. And we don't know whether we're keeping them or, and part of that discussion is even in this, is going to be reflected in our budget. So that, I would say, absolutely correct. It's a wrinkle that we have to yet talk about, and we haven't. Whether we're giving them away, whether we're keeping them, whether we're mothballing them, whether we're going to use them for something else, we have not decided that. So that's there. The other thing whereas I think in terms of like school of choice, again, I will go back to every school we have is a school of choice. Our parents choose where they send their kids. It has become a good phrase to say it's not your neighborhood school, to say school of choice. But what that looks like is very much up to the conversation. Again, we have, and I'm glad the conversation that Ms. Hardy referenced about establishing Barnett as a magnet was addressing a very specific need at that time. And it was designed, no longer serving that specific need, but it was designed to try and attract homeschool parents. It had half-day attendance, and they designed a model around that. That has changed. When we look at the magnet at Hutch, it was designed very much in a context of No Child Left Behind as established as a standalone school and how they were going to meet the, I'll say, constraints of No Child Left Behind legislation. And that has changed. We have had focus schools, okay, as a principal of a focus school in this district. At one point, there were 5 focus schools. We were not magnets. We had our attendance area. We had a focus. In the case of Denali and Barnett, it was science. In the case of North Pole E and Pearl Creek, it was Spanish, and Nordell was social studies. They had their own attendance. We didn't change anything. It was an OAA. If you had space, you got it. We design things, and that is not necessarily the model that we have to have. But let's talk about models. I go with, okay, a magnet. There are magnets around this country in districts that don't look at all staffing levels like their neighborhood schools. They staff them differently, not necessarily with more staff, but sometimes with less staff. We've got a range of services and models that we can look at, and I would hope that we look at that. And if we can have that conversation, I think we can meet um, the needs of our community. One of the things we don't look at is how do we generate revenue, but yet we have a whole cadre of several school communities who have talked about attracting students in. We give them that opportunity. What if it works? Yes, it's a risk. We are at a greater risk if we don't move forward and factor this into our budget. And best preliminary numbers are and estimates is that a charter is going to cost our budget more, have a greater impact. And so I'm certainly looking at how do we have the least impact on our budget? How do we spread our dollars as far as we can? But at the same time, as I look at the numbers, I am very concerned that we're squandering the energies, the enthusiasm that has really built over the last 2 years within our community. Our community came forward last year advocating for our district. They were poised to do it, and I think are poised to do it now. And I think it's a bigger advocacy. The conversations around our schools, all ones looking at, that came together not around not their school, but another school in our, I'm going to say Hunter, got a lot of support, broad support. Same thing for each of our communities. And so I do hope we'll, I can get myself, I've been there where I'm looking this way. And I can give you all the rational logic, but I better start looking this way sometimes. I have to do that. I'm hopeful that we can do that. We can help by a board extending that invitation to the community and say, hey, we can problem solve. We may not come out. I don't know what it'll be coming out. And so I'm real hesitant about saying it should be this model or that model. I'm just saying we need to talk that, and I think we can come up with a good solution. I certainly feel that neighborhood schools are real important. I like the idea of focus more than because it gives more flexibility within, but that's the model of focus that I've seen in this, used prior in this district, but that was 30 years ago, 35, so that same one may not fit now, but let's talk about it and not see limiting. The same thing with magnet. The 2 magnets that were formed 20 years ago, we're pretty close to that. We're different now. Can we bring the ideas that have been brought to us that we have, that our administration, we have new administrations, we have a different environment, we have a state who is saying, we want you to innovate, we want you to do something different. If we do something different, then fund us. If we don't do anything different, what are we going to tell them? So I think we have, it's a very proactive, and there's risk to it. There's no question. If we don't know what we will have until the end of June. No matter what the legislature does, we will not know until probably the end of June. And we have the experience. It's an easy line item veto. And if we don't have what we even begin to think, we're taking a risk as it is. It's a bigger risk if we don't pull upon the energy within our community who really wants public education. Message to us was not to create a charter, another charter. The message to us was say, hey, can we work with you to grow our district? And that wasn't just one school community, that's across the board. So that's where I'm looking, and I'm hopeful, and I'll keep advocating that we have that type of conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Doran. We will have Mr. Burgess and then Ms. Julian.
Thank you. So I have a few things to say here. Struggling at where to start, to be honest. I want to say that, you know, if so it was brought up that, yeah, the state might, you know, the charter application could be brought to the state and the state is likely to approve it. Okay, fair. That's a reasonable, you know, thing to assume here. If we decide to reverse our decision on school closures or to open a charter school right now, that is a decision that's on us. We have made that decision as a board. And in my opinion, that decision would harm the rest of the district. So that's on us if we make that decision because of what we think the state's going to do, or because, you know, people are using political headwinds to put pressure on us. If the state approves it, that's on them. Yeah, we have a problem we have to deal with, a big problem we have to deal with if that happens. But that is a decision that the state will be making, not us. We can walk away with our integrity still intact and say we tried to do the action that had the least harm to all of our students. And I think that's that's the vote that we made in February was a decision that would cause the least amount of harm on school closures. I'm very concerned that, you know, we are in the middle of a very difficult budget season. We have a lot of work in front of us right now. And I'm concerned about the capacity of the board and my own capacity in particular, to be honest. This is hard work. We're doing a lot. Many of us have regular 40-hour-week jobs and families that are sacrificing right alongside of us in order for us to come and do this work. Now, I don't want to be accused of whining. I'm happy to do the work, but I think it's a serious concern. We need to understand that we are human beings that have a limited capacity and other priorities and this is already very taxing on us physically, emotionally, just considering time itself. If we reverse a decision on school closure because of this pressure that's being put on us, I am concerned about the fairness to other schools. Are we going to open up? Are we going to reverse our decision to close all of the schools that we closed? Because I think that's the only way that we do this fairly. But then we have a huge problem. We've increased our deficit. Even opening just one more school, we're increasing our deficit. We have to make cuts elsewhere that will harm students across the district. Maybe we could preserve PTR by doing something like cutting transportation completely. That's still an equity issue. Huge equity issues involved there. If we set this precedent of opening a charter in response to a school being closed, rather than because a charter makes particular sense for a particular reason, you know, that essentially we might as well just take school closure off the table forever. What's to stop any school from doing the same thing in the future and just applying for a charter? And if the political headwinds stay the same, every one of them is going to get approved, right? Okay. Why not, if we're going to just capitulate to the political headwinds, why not just turn all of our charters into schools, dissolve the central district office altogether?
Mr. Doran, which point of order?
The terminology of capitulate could be disparaging to other board members.
Okay, continue, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was not my intent to be disparaging, and I will withdraw that word capitulate. Um, I think the point remains, though, that the point that I'm trying to make is that we have made a decision because we, as a board, felt that it was the best decision to make that would cause the least harm in the face of declining enrollment, staffing shortages, and a severe budget shortfall, a huge deficit. Okay, reversing that decision means that we are causing harm. I want to say, yeah, I reviewed the magnet application. I spent many hours talking to Pearl Creek parents and staff. I also talked to parents and staff and students from other schools where people are saying that we're not listening to an entire community. It is not the entire community of Pearl Creek that is aligned on this. Some people disagree. Coming to a different conclusion does not mean that we are not listening, that we're not reviewing the data. It just means that we have come to a different conclusion. We are listening to the whole district, the district as a whole, and trying to find the solutions that are best for the district as a whole or cause the least amount of harm to the district as a whole. That's our job. However many hours we've spent with one particular school, our job is to listen to all of them. We have heard criticism from one of the schools that we did vote to close that we didn't talk about them enough as a board. And I can see their point. I went and visited that school. I sat down and talked with the principal, and at one point, the principal told me, she said to me, "Gosh, you're not visiting these schools to make your job any easier, are you?" No, no, we're not. We do this work because it's important. We listen to everybody because it's important to do that. And then we make our decisions based on what we think is best. I voted the way that I did because I truly thought that it was what was best for the greatest amount of people, of students in this district. And it is frustrating to be back at the table having a conversation like this again. Now, we can talk about, like, well, we've lost some of our greatest advocates. We're sure, the choices that we make, every single choice that's in front of us has the potential to, make people lose steam on their advocacy, to turn people away, to create adversaries. But I want to say that we are not turning anybody into adversaries. If they decide to be our adversaries, that is a choice that they have made. Okay? I can understand people being upset, being angry, disagreeing with our decision, seeing it a different way. And I don't blame them for it, frankly. I really don't. This is tough. I'm angry too. I'm frustrated. But if they want to position themselves as adversaries, that's a choice that they're making, not a choice that we are forcing upon anybody. Going to the state board to approve a charter school, that is also a choice that is being made by people. We can talk about the data behind the magnet. Okay, there was a survey that was done. It was promising. I said that from the dais when we voted to close schools. I think that information was promising. I was impressed with the collection of it. I'm also a scientist, and I am very cautious with data and with the limitations of data. And when we're talking about data like that, projecting increasing enrollment for 1 year, I have a lot of questions. How was the data collected? We understand it was through a survey. Okay, how was that survey conducted? Was it scientific? Was it, how can we ensure that the people who answered a certain way would actually follow through with their answer? There are many, many risks. And the reality of a model like Magnet is that it often, it might take more than a year to get established. And in the meantime, we have an immediate crisis on our hands that we are trying to deal with. And, you know, when we talk about losing students from, declining, you know, losing enrollment because of the decisions we make, or losing supporters, or, you know, hurting people's advocacy efforts, I question what choices are available to us that don't come with that risk. If we open a charter and we have to increase PTR, I know for a fact there are parents who will choose to go somewhere else. I talked to some close friends of mine who I grew up with, who have built their house here, who their entire family and all of their support network, their friends are here. And they were considering leaving the state because they're concerned about class sizes increasing for their kids who are getting close to school age. So if we have, you know, a magnet school that draws in more students, that's great. But are we going to draw in those students if the class sizes are 30? I'm just throwing out a hypothetical number. I don't know what class sizes would actually be if we ended up adding a school back into our budget. But you know, these are important questions. We have to look at the whole picture. So again, you know, where I'm landing on this is if the legal advice, if we hear from Deed that they, you know, they believe that that the 60-day deadline is, or that our policy is outside of state statute or in conflict with state statute. If that's what we hear, then yes, we should review this application. But you know, absent that, I am concerned about our capacity. I'm concerned about favoring one particular community over others because they are able to, because they happen to be able to show up a lot and advocate. I don't want to lose their advocacy efforts for the district as a whole. But again, that's a choice that they're going to make, that they have to make on their own. Yeah, and that's where I am. I don't feel that we have the capacity right now or the budget to be considering an additional charter school at this time. I'm not saying that I would never consider it, but I am saying that right now does not feel like the right time to me. It is a major challenge just to get through this budget. And there are many equity issues that come up when we're talking about opening a charter school in a deficit environment. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. We're going to go to Miss Maple.
I thank you, Mr. Burgess. I find myself in this conversation getting really caught up in unknown risk and losing sight of what Mr. Burgess said, which is that we made our decision. And if the state chooses to, over the course of whatever this becomes, override that decision, that is on the state. That is not the fiscally responsible decision that we as a board have made. Which is what I said in my closing comments, however long ago that was now. And I think is an important thing to go back to. We do not know at this time how the state and how the commissioner believe our policy and that state statute interplay. And so if we're hearing that that's the information we need, then it seems like perhaps we've all shared at least our initial thoughts on where we are on this, and that we need more information that is not up to us to get on any of our own timelines. So I guess I'd like to look to our board president and to the administration and ask how you'd suggest we proceed with discussing a budget when there's a large piece of unknown information that kind of seems like we're belaboring a point we don't have enough information to actually, I don't know, come to a clear conclusion on. Thoughts?
Dr. Minor?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. So, I mean, I do think that there's an incomplete picture. And so a piece of that is waiting for the Commissioner of Education to give us an idea of how the state feels our policy corresponds with their state statute. I also think the board, in their budget deliberations for a recommended budget, can be rather conservative in the way that they're budgeting. I think in past conversations, there's been some pretty big assumptions on state revenues, pulling transportation funding. If the board didn't pull all of those large levers at once and did a pretty conservative recommended budget, then you allow yourself some room to absorb a magnet or a charter school down the road. If, to Miss Morgan's terminology, you build a rosy budget and you get yourself pretty far extended, that does not give you the flexibility to flex much past that. If we go down this path and it becomes a reality, you would like to add a charter or a magnet, and you're already too far extended, you do not have the capital resources to actually invest in that school. And so that would be my recommendation. Let's hear what the Commissioner of Education has to say on the charter. And then as we're building out this recommended budget, be pretty conservative in the assumptions that we're making.
Thank you, Dr. Minor. I'm going to throw myself in. I agree that with what Dr. Minor said, I full-heartedly agree that we have a little bit more time. We wait for the Commissioner of Education. I'm hopeful she'll get back to Dr. Minor here in the next couple days. She seemed very but you never know. I mean, sometimes she ends up really busy. And we go forward with the recommendation that she sets forward. We've already slated out some time to be able to do this once that comes through, so that we could still move forward with our budget. And if we need, depending on what her recommendation would be and consensus from the board, we could hear this. That's where I'm at. With that, I would like to make sure that we don't get too far off track, because some of our comments have. I would like to keep it back focused on the charter, but we'll go to Mrs. Julian, Mrs. Hardy, and then Mr. Doran.
Okay, thank
Sorry,
you.
Mrs. Doran.
She's a very nice person.
So I want to say something. So Mrs. Hardy said, this is a group of folks when we talk about the charter school and the data that they did. And I looked at that. I looked at the raw data and also the summarized data and said that they are offering new enrollment. However, they're not offering that. No one can offer that. Nobody can offer that. what's being offered, what's on the table, I want to look at the facts and the data and not make any assumptions beyond that. What's on the table is the word lottery. Sure, we might be able to weight a lottery. Weight it by what? Weight it by neighborhood size. I mean, these are things that are still being considered. And then is that fair and equitable? Is this something that this board would move forward with? I want to talk about that word lottery because that's what's on the table. So when I look at my North Star through this whole budget process, it's lowering PTR for all, because if I think about what's driving people away, I hear PTR quite a bit. Class size is too big. What's driving people to charter schools? My family, we went for a year to a charter school. The first thing that you hear, class size. Class sizes is this. We keep our class size as this. We maintain class size at this level. There are gross inequities in class sizes between our charters and our neighborhood schools. But this board can control that. So to the point that and I'm not suggesting that our charters go up. Why? Because we know it works. We know that smaller class sizes leads to more individualized attention. We see it we saw it with our neighborhood schools out in Salcha and out in Two Rivers. Small class sizes, more personalized attention, a very tight-knit community. So when I think about PTR and what we're trying to do here, what I'm trying to do here is how can we lower our PTR for all? Because I believe that if we're able to provide more personalized attention in more of our schools, that we will be able to then potentially draw some students back. And then the other thing that I'm trying to do when you're building risk, so when you're building risk within a company, when you're building risk within a department, when you're trying to look at growth, there's always an element of risk that's built in. That's understandable. But you need to jump to that risk from a point of stability that's not going to tank everything else. And right now it feels as though the only giant levers we have left, and I'll say it, are increasing PTR, taking away all art for all students. I mean, these are the massive vertical cuts that we would have to decide as a board if we want to build stability, if we're valuing stability. And we are hearing from our educators that the lack of stability in our district, that every year we're talking about putting another school closure on. Every year we're talking about maybe cutting this or cutting that. The amount of instability we have had, which is not our own doing, it's also the state's doing and our borough, but the amount of instability that we've had has also driven educators away. So we also have a very real problem that isn't a fiscal problem, but it's a vacancy problem. And our vacancies with educators, we heard at the budget committee meeting that Anderson Crawford's PTR right now, based on their vacancies, is at 28.5 at Anderson Crawford. That's a huge eye opener for me, because we can set the PTR, but if we don't have people to actually fill those positions, that's a big problem. That means that our set PTR is actually going to go up in some buildings. Somebody might be budgeted for 17 educators at the beginning of the year. They can only fill 16, and then they lose a couple in the middle of the year, and now they're dissolving classes and pushing PTR way up across all grade levels. So I think that when we talk about adding things back into our budget, and so to the point, charters or magnets, when we think about those, I ask everyone to think about a couple things. Actually, three things. Location, location, location. Okay? We need to minimize risk. A larger lottery is a bigger risk. You can't deny that, because you just don't know what's going to happen with a lottery unless you decide to weight it unfairly. And those are things that we have to consider. So how do you minimize risk? you put a school of choice in a place that might have a larger walk zone so that your lottery is lower and that your in area attendance walkers are greater. That's one way to do it. Another way is you might put it out in a place like, let's say, Two Rivers, that won't necessarily have an opportunity to draw from neighborhood schools because there's a long drive out there. But yet there's a super high concentration of out of district homeschool students there. I mean, so these are the things that we are going to have to weigh as a board. And I ask us to think about those three words, location, 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 and how are we minimizing risk and managing risk? Because yes, we need to take a risk to innovate and grow. However, we also must weigh the precarious balancing act that we are trying to navigate as we face the realities of and I'll say a rosy $16 million projected deficit, which we've already taken steps to bridge. However, if things don't work out in our favor across the board and it's larger than 16 million, oh my gosh. So then I think adding another school right now, I want to know what's the size of the lottery, because the size of the lottery shows us the type of risk that we'd be taking and also potentially grabbing students from out of district. But I think that there's other ways that we can do it, and I think it's with homeschool. And I'm sorry I deviated, but I don't want to lose sight of that.
Thank you, Mrs. Julian. So I did get a request for a recess, but we're gonna go to Mrs. Hardy first, then we'll take a recess, then we'll go to Mr. Dorn.
I tuned in and I listened to the budget committee meeting after the fact, and I remembered listening to that principal talk about how there were vacancies and how charters could affect vacancies. And it's in our contract that you cannot place a teacher at a charter. Teachers have to willingly choose to teach at charters. All of the teachers currently signed up on the Pearl Creek application are willingly choosing that that's where they want to go, along with their principal. It's a choice. Educators choose where they want to work. We have lots of educators in this community who could be teaching right now for our district, and they're not. When I left our school district, I didn't leave our school district because I didn't love teaching. I left our school district because at the time, the leadership in the school district was awful. I didn't know much about the superintendent, but I did know the leadership within the SPED department, and it pushed me right out. And then when they sent me an exit survey, I didn't fill it out. I had told my husband at the time, I never want to work for that district again. He was shocked. Leadership matters. How this board conducts itself matters. I've heard other educators be like, I'm not thrilled. I don't feel like I'm being listened to. I'm the only person on this board who's not running for election next year and is currently looking at what my employment options are. And as a certified teacher, I've been checking out where district openings are. Is that something I'd be willing to do? I've also been exploring that, maybe Costco looks pretty good. They pay pretty well. I could leave it at the door. The choices we make at that dais affect whether or not people are willing to work with us. The way we conduct ourselves at that dais affect whether or not people are willing to work with us. And the way we conduct ourselves out in the community affects whether or not people are willing to work for us. People are not widgets. They have choices, and they'll take different jobs and work outside of their degree fields and do different things if you push them to that point. I am an educator, I am a teacher, and the only thing I ever wanted to do with my life was teach kids. That's it, and that's still the only thing I've ever wanted to do with my life. Nothing in this world makes me happier than seeing a student light come on when they get a concept. And I know that is true for so many educators in this community. It's why we go into the profession, and it's not about the money, but it is nice to be respected. To Mr. Burgess's comments, I'm going to say it's not any actions we took at this dais. It's the behavior and actions of certain board members that have taken not at the dais and not through a vote that have turned our allies into adversaries. They've harmed and alienated members of our community. Phone calls and in-person conversations full of misinformation and promises of false hope from members of this board has eroded the trust of our community. Nobody seems to know it, but it's what's happening. And I'm hearing about it from community members. So yeah, it's easy to say, well, they should do better, but it would be a whole lot easier if board members weren't calling them days after a vote and saying, actually, we messed up and I'm going to do all this stuff.
With that, we will take a 10-minute recess. Be back here at 7:15. Welcome back. The board is now back from recess and we will continue on with our discussion around charter schools. I would like to spend some time around our balancing act as well. So we will continue on with our comments from board members and we will go to Mr. Doran.
And among my comments were relative to what you just commented on, and both yourself and Dr. Meinert had mentioned. I mean, there are lots of things that we need to talk about, and that we get into some of those tonight. But as well, because this is an important thing, I think it's just if we come to some conversation around the fact that we need to have this conversation. We need to look at it. The dollar, first of all, I want to say within this, our concerns should be focused on the state. They're the ones who provide our funding, the bulk of it. And the situation that we're in, and that I just saw a new pencil chart that when you take FY24 dollars, which we have to remember are basically 2 years out of date, because we're talking about $26, that the high point was 2007 for funding. And so where there's been some little adjustments, the line is a declining line from 2007 to the present day. So if we have, so I'm focusing my frustrations, my annoyance with the state, not with anybody within our community. The dollar amount is something that we do need to factor in here, how we solve this issue. I also looking very much in terms of when we talk about our work, administration work, we've also have offers for people to help us. Not that we're doing, they're not asking us to do all the work. They're not asking the administration to do all the work. We have lots of offers. I am very thankful for the questions that, considerations that each board member has put on the table and Dr. Meinert has put on the table, because those are questions that we need to ask. You know, the lottery question for one is a question that we need to look at. If there's a lottery, again, I say keep our minds open. There doesn't have to be a lottery. There are lots of different things keeping our minds open and looking at what is there. The charter application itself raises some things that say, wow, wait a minute, how can we do this? In essence, it was what their magnet was looking towards, and indeed whether things that could be replicated in other schools, but also not putting on the expectation that every school has to come up with some great plan. They're doing good work. Do we go ahead and market it? Do we get that word out? Relative to this, and I'm going to keep it very short because I don't want it to get out of the charter thing, but I think it's relevant to it in terms of, because this charter and the magnet idea that was raised, or whatever we want to call it, focus, I mean, they've had some conversations around that, is putting out their ideas and saying, what do we do? What do we talk about? In some ways, they've been doing this for a while. And so that's why they could put a charter together, application together pretty quickly. Other reasons for that, being able to do that with the expertise they have, but within the ideas, the concepts. And in a conversation, I found out we actually offer a lot of AP classes. And and a lot of our times our conversations have been, we don't offer enough, we're losing them. But there are students, I was at West this morning, And I found out they have students coming from other schools to take AP classes there. We don't advertise that. We don't promote that. I didn't know it. I was under the assumption, because of conversations we've had, that there wasn't much. So this, actually, the charter piece puts that out there, the conversation that led to the charter. Again, it wasn't the charter that brought the conversation to the table. It was the conversation that led to this. So again, keeping, ask the questions. They're good, and I'm just going to use lottery for a minute because it has to be on the table. But what we do with it, how do we get there? One of the things, and I cannot remember the quote, I'll just say it's age, but the idea of definition of insanity is doing the same thing time and time and time again. We've got some new opportunities to try things, to build on that and use the budget that we have, but also use that to be able to promote the state and put them on the spot to say, fund us. Another reason to give us money. And using, and several people have commented it, and I'm thinking, we've had a legislator who sat in this room and said, you got to use their language. Okay. We can do that. We have an opportunity to do that. PTR has come up, absolutely an incredible and important piece. But over the last several days, I've really been thinking about the place that PTR plays in our schools. I had the opportunity to have classrooms of 19 and classrooms of 35. I never had a parent say, I'm pulling out because the class is too big. I can honestly say I never had a parent who came to enroll their kid and said, your classes are too big. I'm not going to bring my kid here. Now, there may have been parents who said they weren't going to do that, who never came in the door. Okay. I do go back very much to Rick Cross, a former superintendent, when the board was really wrestling with PTR, and he said it's, there's actually no research that really says what PTR should be. There's some that has been cited, but when you look at the research, it does not really support that. But he said it's common sense. If you add one kid to a classroom and you have 19 kids in the classroom, what's 20? Not a big deal. But if you've got 29 kids in a classroom, and that's not the 30th, that has a little bit more impact. He says common sense is, you don't need the research. It's just if you have smaller groups. But I really went to that PTR. By the way, the 35 was the PTR for kindergarten one time.
Is this going to charter schools, Mr. Dorn?
It is, because PTR is one of the things that, and thank you for keeping me on line with it, but I was trying to think in terms of that, and the piece with the charter school directly, the connection is, it's the culture, it's what people feel around the school. And that's part of what this conversation is, that I hope we can have the conversation, we can do some problem solving, and in actuality, the charter application could be withdrawn. But if we don't have a conversation, I think that limits us. So as we look at the full budget, because these are all linked, we made two decisions, and I'll wrap with this. We've made two decisions outside the budget that impact the budget. But we don't, when we made those decisions, we didn't and still do not know really the impacts. The custodial contract, we don't know what that impact is. We don't have even a bid. The closing a school, we made the best decisions that we could, given the information we had. The custodial contract, people made the best decision they could based on that. And so I'm just asking that as we go on, discuss the big budget picture, we have to come up with dollars someplace, or to be able to make our case why the state needs to increase our revenue, whether promoting and marketing what our schools are doing can increase our revenue, that we do that. And so we look at that package, but we keep open and not shut off the conversation and get people further away in corners. So.
Thank you, Mr. Dorn. Ms. Carol Hubbard.
Thank you. I don't want to appear to be argumentative, Mr. Dorn. So I'm just going to say that, well, the comment that you made about the PTR, that no parent pulled their student out due to PTR, might be true. And however, the research shows that smaller groups tend to produce better results. They have more focused and productive work environments. And like you said, it does kind of seem like common sense. And maybe they're not going to pull their kids out or not going to go to a school because it's higher PTR. But I think that as we're realizing in Family Engagement Committee that it's difficult to figure out how to engage the families that are working, that aren't home, they're already sort of detached from the school environment, from their child's world. Having a smaller...
Ms. Carol Hubbard, does this have anything to do with the charter schools?
Well, yes, because if we add a charter school, we're going to have to increase PTR. So I just want to, okay,
Yep,
I'm
nope, that
just
makes sense.
advocating for lower
Yep.
PTR.
Okay.
Okay,
I was just trying to make the connection there. Thank you.
thanks.
Yep. So with that, I do believe administration has the consensus that they need when it comes to the charter school at hand. And so we will wait on word from the commissioner. Hopefully that comes sooner than later. And then Dr. Meinert will get with the board at that time and let us know our path forward from there. And then we can go from there. With that, I did want to bring up another item for discussion tonight, which is our work session on March 17th. In discussions with Vice President Maple and Dr. Meinert, that is the week that we have slated for budget approval. And so we thought that it would be best to extend our work session on the 17th to start earlier in the day to allot us as much time as needed to go through the balancing act and get a consensus on where the board is for budget so that we can go into Tuesday and hopefully come out with a recommended budget, or the board's recommended budget, that Tuesday, if needed, possibly that Wednesday. And so, I mean, if board members could just shake their head, yes or no, on whether or not they're in favor of starting at 1:30 on the 17th, that'd be great. Seeing a consensus? Mrs. Julian? Oh, Mr. Burgess, does that sound okay with you?
If you'll give me a moment, I can bring up my work calendar and tell you about all the conflicts that I do or do not have.
Just so we can, yeah, just looking for a consensus and making sure that board members would be available.
Could I
Mr.
double check what time you're talking about?
Yes, it's March 17th at 1:30 is the day that we're looking at. We have a work session scheduled for that evening, but we would like to extend it into the day. We're seeing a consensus here in the boardroom.
Or as I can see, that seems okay to me. I'll have to confirm
Okay, if there is any issues, if board members do have issues with that day, if they could send an email to me and Dr. Minor, and then we can go from there. But as of right now, we're seeing a consensus that for the 17th, 1:30 will be good. And we'll look for any emails that may say otherwise. With that, it is currently 7:30.
President Burnett,
Oh, Mr. Burgess?
I may have a conflict on that day. I can see what I can do and I will get back to you, but.
Okay.
Yeah,
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Yeah, just let Dr. Minor and myself know. With that, it is 7:30. If the board wishes, we can continue on for another 30 minutes to an hour and go into budget. Ms. Julian? If that's the consensus, just shake a head. Yeah, okay. So with that, we will go into budget, and we can have discussions around the balancing act. If Mr. DeGraw and Dr. Minor would be prepared and ready for that. Fantastic. Mrs. Julian?
Okay, I want to bring something up on to the rest of the board that I put in email today, and it wasn't that long ago that I put this in email. So, and we also had a major field trip today that most of our educators attended. So I am not expecting that you have looked over that email at this point. However, I want to bring it up to the board. So I've looked at other ways that we could potentially get creative without, you know, in a sense, shooting ourselves in the foot of increasing PTR maybe unnecessarily. And I wanted to, and I looked at Juneau School District and Matsu School District. When we project, and also in my professional capacity with the university, have looked at two different things that we could potentially do, and that is our vacancy rate. And so the Juneau School District right now budgets a 3% vacancy rate for their equivalent of ESSA and their equivalent of FEA employees. That, and I don't have the dollars right in front of me, but that equates to, I think it's just over 2 million. And that's in their budget, and you can see it in their fiscal year 26 budget that I emailed to administration and also to President Burnett. And then Matsu School District also budgets, and in the fiscal year 26 Matsu School District budget, it states, oh my gosh, my computer, it states that they're showing the $28.8 million savings from prior years, as well as projected savings. This is important. Projected savings in the current year predominantly due to increased position vacancies. When we're talking about vacancies, I know that there's ways that we can, in our budget right now, it looks like we budget for a 100% fill rate of all of our vacancies. However, I know that in practice, that's, you know, even though you want to get 100% fill rate, anybody, you know, at any given time, you know, doesn't necessarily have that 100% fill rate, even though that's what you want to work towards. But reality happens, and there's vacancy rates all across the board usually. So I wanted to ask the administration, if not tonight to have this available, but what would be a conservative, and that's very key, a conservative vacancy rate that we might be able to budget for. Also, is that even possible if we are not also at the same time budgeting for leave usage? Because I know that especially with my professional experience with the university, that's a large thing that we have to budget for on a department by department level. So I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit, but if there was even like a difference of a 500,000 or 750,000 or maybe even $1 million difference between those two figures, I'd like us to consider that as something that a big lever that we could put into this framework. Thank you.
Mr. DeGraw?
So there's a lot of layers to the response to that and to that concept of budgeting vacancies. I'm not necessarily prepared to respond fully to that. One large item would be a question, I don't know the answer to this, is are those districts budgeting for any kind of increase related to the 680? And so so conceptually, budgeting for vacancies puts a district out on the ledge, so to speak. We are already out on a ledge, and additional items along the lines of budgeting for vacancies. Again, there's a lot of layers on, yeah, so if we have vacancies, do we save 100% of that vacancy? The emphatic answer is no. There are other costs that pop up. Our vacancies are quite low currently this year compared to the past 2 to 3 years. Coming out of COVID, each year we've chipped away at it, and quite honestly, our vacancies have gotten lower and lower each year. So again, there's a ton of layers to this, to the response to this. That would any kind of significant budgeting of vacancies would make me uncomfortable based on several factors. A large one is the 680, assuming the full 680, of which the governor does have some increases in revenue in his proposal, but they aren't anywhere near the $16 million that we're assuming. So again, I could keep going, but I want to make sure I put together a full response to where I can respond adequately.
Yeah.
Follow up, Ms. Julian.
Yeah, and if I may, I just want to, I know that I'm asking this without giving proper and adequate notice to the administration. So I want to just say that it was not my intention to put anybody on the spot, but I really wanted to bring that up because I looked at those two other school districts and just looked through their budgets and also reflected on ways that at the university we've handled similar fiscal environments. And that looked like it could potentially, but I also understand that we already have made some out on the limb things, and I've agreed with you on that. So yeah, but thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No,
Mr.
and I don't feel put on the spot, Ms. Julian. I think if memory serves me correctly, I don't want to, the number 400 jumps out for Juneau without, we don't necessarily want to follow all districts around the state and how they've managed their finances in the past few years.
Yeah.
They are not, I'm pretty confident Juneau is not assuming a full 680. So I saw a number in the past few weeks. I don't want to necessarily get into specifics, but I'm pretty sure they're not assuming a full 680. I'm not sure. I can't respond to Matt Sue. I have no idea what Matt Sue's assuming in their budget.
Thank you, Mr. DeGraw. Mrs. Hardy, did I see your hand up? Okay. Ms. Maple.
Question about balancing act. I'm assuming everything's fair game now. I am certain that this has been explained, and I apologize for asking it again. When we're looking at the activities funding that is listed in the balancing act, is that talking about further reducing? What specifically are we talking about with where we could go up to 239,000 at the middle school level and 500,000 at the high school level?
Yeah, so that's further reductions from current funding levels to this.
But what activities are, what is that talking about?
That's what we would need the board to make a decision on the level of cuts, and then it is pretty hypothetical. We would need to determine based on the level of cuts what activities would fall in line with that potential savings. At the middle school level, like you said, $239,000 funds all middle school activities. It's important to note that it's not just sports, it's activities. Same at the high school level.
I don't want to do that. Never mind.
Any other questions from the board regarding budget balancing act? Everything is fair game. Mrs. Julian.
You can go to others if others have anybody, but I'd like to be in the queue.
So far, it's just you and Mr. Dorn.
Okay. Well, then I will go because I'm sure that Mr. Dorn will have other ones too. That's just my calculated risk.
Well, in that case,
for
Mr.
tonight.
Dorn, no.
Yeah. So the other one that I'd like to just verify when we're looking at the charter school costs in particular, and Mrs. Hardy brought this up last week, and I just want to reflect on that again. On the revenue side, on the state revenue side, we are assuming a BSA equivalent of an increase of a BSA equivalent, and that would just be within the BSA, not one-time funding. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then on the right side, there's under charter school, the supplemental charter revenue funding. But we can assume that if everything is in a BSA, we wouldn't be doing any supplemental charter revenue funding because that only occurs when there's one-time funding, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so then I like what you said before about conservatively budgeting. Should we then would the recommendation be that we zero that out and assume a BSA increase of 680, or should we also include what was recommended, the 340 BSA equivalent through foundation formula funding? I'm just not sure how to do
Mr.
that
McGrath.
in the most accurate way.
Yeah, so in my research, I have determined if there is a permanent increase on the state side, on the revenue side, then that negates the $500,000 in savings on the expenditure side. So I have confirmed that. As to the question of should we assume a BSA increase, I'll let other people give their opinions. My opinion is I would in no sphere assume a permanent BSA increase.
Okay.
But obviously that's a subject that can be debated.
Mr. Doran.
Part of my question is a process one, and the balancing act, I really appreciate that the administration has worked on that and put it together, but it's very limiting. And it's good to kind of see where the things are. But I don't know if part of our process is to go through the suggestions and to look at that and see whether there's some feeling there. I mean, we will continue that on the 17th, maybe even tomorrow night. We could recess this meeting and continue work session tomorrow night after our regular meeting.
Mr.
But
Doran.
whatever that, I'm just putting out their ideas, you know. To go through, you know, and some of the pros and cons. I know there's things that board members have suggested that are not in here in this version. So it's hard to say, well, if we only focus on these things. The one thing that
If I may comment on that just real quick, not to interrupt, but so the things that you're not seeing are things that lacked board support. That was one thing it reiterated last week, was that if you supported something a board member spoke to, it was super important to speak up in support of that so that it would end up in the balancing act. As Mr. DeGraw and Dr. Minert were not just going to put every small thing that every board member wanted in there. There needed to be some sort of support so that we didn't end up with chaos, if that makes sense.
Right, that does, and I'm fine with that. And I would just, in line with that, is there were things put on the table that did not get much conversation. That were just, especially towards the end, we just put some things, and we may have support as we talk about some of the issues. There is one that I would like to, and as your note the other day said, you know, bring forward, but I did bring it last week. I would like to, again, I'm looking at the revenue side, and administration has mentioned, and the State of the Union mentioned, looking at the impact aid, and are we getting what we should be getting, and counting in. I think you actually referenced that, counting all that we should be counting all the students that, and so I'd like to see that reflected, that as one of the options. I don't know how much risk we want to take, but if there's a piece out there that you're able to look at, have been able to look at, because I know the administration has been working hard to try and find, you're combing through laws, you're combing through what we count and what we haven't, and I look at it as nickel and diming, and it may not have been, the cost benefit might not have been worth it, but now it is. So I'd like some consideration on the revenue side that that might be factored in. What you're finding and looking at. We may not want to include it because it's still too preliminary, but I was real pleased when you mentioned it and brought it to the fore at the state of the schools.
Dr. Minor?
Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely that we would get additional funds for this budget cycle. I mean, we are playing the long game on it, and Ellis has been spending a tremendous amount of time and trying to look at different ways and having communications both at the state level and with our congressional delegation on ways that we can kind of break through this barrier that we're seeing of not receiving all of our impact aid funding. But I definitely think it would be preliminary to put any kind of projected revenue in this year's budget. I'm hopeful in the future that we may get there. I know Ms. Hardy's definitely been doing some work at the state level as well, which I appreciate, to have legislators better understand this arena. It is complex, and how that fits in with the RLC, and people are just getting up to speed on those impacts. But I do feel like it would be preliminary to add it into this year's revenue source for budgeting.
Thank you, Dr. Minor. Mrs. Hardy?
On the same impact aid, I have been learning about how the federal government everywhere else does it, and I can forward along an explainer. There's actually a association that is called the Something Association of Impacted Schools, and they do a whole explainer on what impact aid is and how it works. And it explains the count and the idea that a student who is residing on those lands counts as a full student. A student who is military connected but lives off of federal lands only counts as a fraction of a student, and just all the different ways. And so when you're referring to the counts and getting that number bigger, and there are certain like REAs that do really good jobs chasing down those numbers, that helps some. But one of the biggest problems, if you're removing Alaska's uniqueness from it, is that at a federal level, they have consistently underfunded that program continuously year after year, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller. And so you're given like a priority number by the federal government as how much of your funding is made up of impact aid. And the larger amount of your funding is made up of impact aid, the closer you get funded to 100% of what you qualify for. And then many districts don't. And I don't know what our current rank is as far as like how much we qualify for. It's probably not as big because we're a large district and our basic need is pretty large. So it's a game. It's worth finding those students, but as Dr. Meinert said, it's a long game, and with the state currently taking so much of that impact aid, it might amount to a couple thousand more dollars, and that's if the federal government funds a federal entitlement program, and those are getting to big ifs at this point. There you go.
Thank you, Mrs. Hardy. Ms. Maple?
I forgot what I was going to ask. Let you know when I'm ready again.
We will throw you into the queue when you remember. Ms. Carol Hubbard?
I just wanted to come back to the elementary class size. Is there any way that we could do a K3 and a 4-5? I mean, I know that's a lot. There's already like 8 options or something there, and it's going to require a ton.
Yes, we've done that in the past. Could you be specific in terms of what kind of numbers you'd want to look at for K3? Would you want it to line up with the options we currently have K5?
Ask me that again. So like 25 for K3?
Yeah, down to like 23, I think, is what we currently have in Balancing Act.
We have 27.5.
That's what's checked, correct. But on the savings side, if you go further up in Balancing Act, we take it all the way to a PTR of 23. So would you want it to basically be reflective K3 and then 4-5 have the same
No,
PTR numbers?
no, because I think the K3 would be the smaller numbers, like the 23, 24, maybe 25, and leave the 4 5s at 26, 27, and 28 possibly, or something like that. I don't know. I was looking at a budget, and I mean, every single grade level had, they were increased by grade level, almost stair steps with their PTR. And I don't remember if that was one of our old budgets, but it just, I don't know, sparked the idea to do the same.
I think it's also important to note PTR is a staffing model. It's not a class cap size. And so our principals already do a pretty great job of prioritizing class sizes K3. You'll often see K3 class sizes below the 25, and then our upper grade levels will be larger. And so I don't know that there's a need to really necessarily do that. Because again, at the end of the day, you might artificially set that here, but that's not a capped class size at that school level. And the principal is going to make the best decision at the time in the fall with the staff that he has and kind of the grade banding numbers that are coming into that school.
Perfect. I don't want to create any more work then.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Okay, I've got Miss Julian, or no, wait, sorry, I've got Miss Maple, then Miss Julian, then Mr. Doran.
I just wanted to, after the last meeting, a lot of ideas came up from myself and from most people on the board of things that we'd like to see invested in if possible. Some of the things that stand out to me were a communications person, figuring out how to advertise, to recruit, advertise for existing programs, advertise for BEST. And I was talking with Dr. Miner after that meeting, and something that I would just like to float for, I mean, I think where it would belong is an ad back, because we're just going to be cutting, but is when we create that list, I would appreciate if people would think about the idea of having an amount that is sort of an open-ended amount that we would like to be able to use to invest in programs. But rather than, and I know we're not talking about it right now, but to have something like that that's almost a parking lot, so that as we're talking about ideas and we're talking about not doing the same thing over and over again and wanting to innovate and wanting to do all of these things, that perhaps it could, what that could look like is, if funds allow, having an amount that we revisit later, so that we don't get bogged down in the weeds trying to figure out what that looks like now, but that there is an actual consideration given to, should we be able to invest in anything, that we would want to prioritize an amount, that whether it's the administration or the board being able to go back and look to the conversations we'd had previously, but doing something generic so that it doesn't get in the way of the budget work itself, but still creates sort of a holding plan, because we know that some changes need to be made, but we also know those aren't free. So I just wanted to throw that out, and maybe we'll end up with funding that allows us to return to that conversation. But as ideas come up, maybe that's sort of where they can live.
Thank you, Miss Maple. I will say, just kind of on that subject and add backs and things that we would like to see if, funding comes through. We did get an email from Jeanette Peterson, and Anchorage did a thing where they put forward was it a resolution or a letter that basically stated that their ad backs would be dedicated to PTR and stuff. And so if the board is in favor, that would be something that I did say we could talk about, and that we would possibly be in favor of doing, just to dedicate our ad backs to PTR. With that, we'll go back to our list, and Miss Julian, you are next.
Thank you. If I can talk to a couple different points, just some reflections that I've had since our last meeting, if that's okay. Okay. So Anchorage had I believe it was an addendum because because their budget has already been passed based on a $1,000 BSA. So I also like the idea of us doing something formal, whether that's a motion or some sort of formal vote that says this is our add back list and making it very clear that this is what we're prioritizing. So thank you for bringing that forward, whatever that looks like based on our time frame. I'm supportive of that. Something more formal than what we've done in the past. So I want to talk about the charter school, and it just I just want to make sure that I am understanding this correctly for the add backs of a charter school. So right now we have 3 on the list as potential investments: a 500 student charter school at 3.5 million, a 300 student charter school at 2.5 million, and an 80 student charter school at 650,000. To my, when I do the math, when I do my quick and dirty math on the side here, it's really just looking at, and to administration through the chair, if I can just get a confirmation if I'm doing this correctly, it's just looking at that number of students. So either 500, 300, or 800, using the assumption of that BSA, instead of going to the district, would flow to the charter. And that assumption is 6,640, the BSA plus 680. And then also assuming the additional costs above the 4% that we, in a sense, subsidized all of our charters at, which is about 7% costs. That's how you're getting to like the estimates, the 3.5 million, the 2.5, and the 650.
All right, so I might need you to go through those again. Those numbers are including full revenue to the charter.
Yep.
So I didn't do a 50%, or that's full revenue to the charter.
Yep.
What that doesn't include is, in the case of Pearl Creek Elementary, we've determined it's likely that we would lose the hold harmless. If a charter school is stood up in their building subsequent to the attendance area school closing, it is likely we will lose the hold harmless. So that $3.5 million number is more like $4.1 to $4.3 million in cost to the district. We just haven't had time to update the tool. Just wanted to let the board know that detail.
No.
What were the other questions you had, Ms. Julian, on the assumptions baked in?
Nope, I think that was it, the
Okay.
assumptions. And so when we're talking about a cost to the district, it's really the loss of that revenue at the district level that's going to go over with the students too.
Correct. And
Yeah.
board members don't need to worry about the revenue side up higher. That is net cost to the district, comparing a scenario with the district with the charter school in existence, and that contrasted against without the charter school in existence.
Okay.
So no need to worry about the revenue side, but just know the assumption there is full revenue, full BSA revenue to the charter.
Okay.
So if the board were to make a decision, if a charter were to stand up and the board were to make a decision that we would only allocate 50% of one-time funding, and we did receive 50% of funding, exactly 680, that number would drop. The cost would drop, but I don't have the exact number at this time of how much it would drop.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll just, if I may just, and I'll do more of a formal report tomorrow about our budget meeting, because it was a very good conversation that we had last Wednesday. I don't remember, Mr. Dorn. Anyway, it was one night last week that we met, and the budget committee was there. The consensus around revenues that we got from the budget committee, and we're still getting responses. So if you're listening, make sure that you do your homework, your optional homework assignment. Were that we should be very conservative. And what people meant by that was, don't assume local revenue above 60. Use the projected enrollment that is proposed, knowing that this year we used our fund balance to cover those unexpected enrollment declines that mostly were from removing the dual enrollment from private school use of best revenue. And then the state revenue, really people talked about not going above the 680, but to Mrs. Maple's point, the add back list, people were saying that if you are going to assume an 800 BSA or 1000 BSA, put that on your add back list, not in your budget. And so I thought that was really good feedback from the budget committee. And if I can talk about North Star College, so I've definitely been critical of that because, again, the North Star for me is how the heck do we get our PTR low? And I will say to Mr. Dorn, that conversation is very real in the world today. And I think it's because there's disparities. There's so many more schools of choice now that have lower PTR than our neighborhood schools that the conversation around PTR is very prevalent, especially at the elementary school level. It's almost the first thing of, but those schools, those class sizes are so small. Why would you take your kid? You know, it's a real conversation that's happening all the time. So PTR, to the extent that we can invest in PTR, I have been very critical about everything except two things: PTR, and then in the same breath, educators. So keeping educators in classrooms and lowering the amount of students in every single classroom. To that point, through the chair to the administration, there was a conversation. There was a really eye-opening about North Star College in particular. I had a false assumption that, and I'm going to say it was a false assumption, that North Star College reduces the amount of AP course offerings or even dual enrollment offerings in our high schools. But I've done my homework. Ms. Loa Carol Hubbard and I spent time there this last week. I dug into the numbers and I realized that's not necessarily the truth. The real impact of losing those opportunities comes when we increase PTR at the secondary level. And if the administration can talk a little bit about that, that was an assumption. I feel like that's in the community that I had, but it was really good to dig into the numbers and go, oh, I was wrong in that assumption. So I don't know if you can talk to
Mrs.
that.
Gillum.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Julian, for the opportunity. So yes, so that's when you're looking at a secondary schedule, similar to elementary, but a little bit different because you're looking at what are the course offerings. And so schools work really hard to have what we refer to as student-driven schedules. So right now, all of our high schools and our middle schools are collecting data and information from students. They're getting course requests related to beyond their core academics, and even in high school in their core academics, what are the courses that they want to take? Or what are the courses that they need to take? And again, we've talked about how PTR is a target. So that's a target average class size that we're working towards, that we're going to do our best to try to find in all of our classes. But often in our advanced classes, and then also in the classes that we offer for more support, we're aiming, because of the nature of those classes, usually we're looking for a smaller class size there. A smaller class size when we're trying to support students, and then often, or sometimes, a smaller class size in more advanced classes because there's just fewer classes who are registering for that. So when we look at what AP classes, when a principal and counselors get all these numbers and they're looking at what AP classes, the constraint that happens when we increase our PTR is that it's a higher target that we're aiming for. So right now, the target that schools are aiming for are 31. Next year, we're going to ask them to aim for 33.5. And so the threshold of how far below that number they can have and still offer a class also gets higher and higher. So right now, I might be able to have, say, 23 requests for an AP class and be like, yep, I can still make that happen because overall my PTR will remain the same. But now if we keep increasing that, that decreases the number of educators that we have in our buildings. And so it also consequently decreases our ability to offer those higher level classes. So over the past 3 years since I've been keeping data, we haven't seen a tremendous loss of AP classes. But as we continue to increase PTR at the secondary level, that is a consequence that happens, if that answered your question.
Thank you, Ms. Gillum. Before we go to Mr. Dorn, I just had a real quick question over something Mr. DeGraw said. So you were talking about losing the hold harmless on Pearl Creek if we give it to Pro Creek Charter. Does that count if we were to give the building back to the borough and let the borough handle that? Would we still get the hold harmless then?
So it would still be a school of record of the school district, and so yes, we would still lose the hold harmless.
Okay, thank you.
Regardless of who
Okay,
actually handled the lease with
Yeah.
the charter. Is that what you're gonna, yeah.
okay, that was my question. Mr. Dorn?
I like Ms. Maples' comment about kind of a side deal. I was calling it the investment pool. And then I was looking at the other pool, but it's not a savings pool, but it's money where when I look at some reductions pulled from different areas, I create a pool in my mind and then decide where that might be best applied. I don't look at any of the necessarily at this stage of the game. It may come down to that at the end where we're making choices, but pitting this particular item against this particular item. So, as been referenced, charter schools against PTR. They're separate issues. Magnet against PTR. Or district administration against PTR, although arguably we could close the administrative building and all the staff and still not really necessarily get PTR. But if we get a pool of stuff in that as we go through, so there are items that I've seen that I'm pulling into a pool, even if it's only in the thousands of dollars. And then does that add up enough to where we can do something? Maybe it's a half a PTR, maybe it's something else that we need in investment. So, so I appreciate that, and I hope that maybe we take advantage of that opportunity that Mrs. April offered, whatever we call it. I did want to just say as a principal and in affirming what Dr. Minard said about PTR, especially, it's important to have that flexibility because sometimes that grade that needs the help is not necessarily where they are. And I have worked where we had 3 different levels of target PTR, but within the building and to do the staffing, principals need some flexibility, and I think it does work well within that. So those are my particular comments right now, although I would just add that since we did have a lot of conversation about something between neighborhood school and a charter, that also be something we could add into, and we have some dollar, again, their estimates depends on what, and I don't want to call it a magnet. I don't want to call it focus. If we could come up with a temporary term, theme, whatever, but alternate, I don't know what the theme, but that we don't get into that, but that could be helpful as we go along, whether it's in the investment pool or whether it's right in the middle of the conversation saying these are the trade-offs. So, but not make the pitting things against each other automatically that because we have lots of options within the budget to play with.
Thank you, Mr. Dorn. Mrs. Hardy?
Yeah, back to that same comments about hold harmless on school closures. Do we have an official comment from Deed saying that that is how they would interpret holding it?
We do. So we just learned that today from the Department of Ed, that if it's a similar school that looks like a replacement of the neighborhood school, then that's the way that they would interpret that. And currently it's similar enough that that would be a replacement school rather than a school that's significantly different.
Mrs. Julian?
Can I ask a follow-up only because it's out there in the public ether? If there was a movement of another charter school that's already existing into that facility, would we also lose the hold harmless?
I haven't broached that with the Department of Ed, but I doubt it would because unless a d- so because it's an existing charter school, they already have the way that they handle their enrollment, and I'm assuming they wouldn't necessarily change to accept a huge walk zone or zone of Pearl Creek students. Then I believe at that point in time, the state would say it's significantly different enough so you would receive the hold harmless. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it would be good to have a maybe just clarification on like that from them.
Yeah, I hesitate to walk down too
know.
many scenarios with the state because they have been great in working with in terms of going back and forth. And so if we get to the point where another charter school is interested in that facility and the board would like me to work on a lease with that charter school, then willing to walk down that road with the Department of Ed at that point in time.
Can I just do a follow up on the hold harmless?
Follow up.
We are potentially going to repurpose Midnight Sun Elementary for Best and Star of the North, or that's what's on the table right now, and then also a potential repurposing of Two Rivers with a Best satellite in the. Will we lose our hold harmless in those scenarios?
We wouldn't with Midnight Sun for sure because it's not replacing the neighborhood school. It's significantly different, the types of offerings we would have there. If we're talking about Two Rivers in the sense of having a Best satellite, we would also retain the hold harmless. If we were considering Two Rivers as a charter school, then that could be different.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Hardy.
It's fine. It was answered through that conversation.
Okay. Going to Mr. Dorn.
Just that we keep in mind that, as mentioned earlier in the meeting, we haven't decided in terms of building usages. And part of our conversation around the budget and cost savings, I think we have conversation to come as to whether repurposing a building, for instance, whether a building that we would need to, if we think there's structural things, we don't want to run it as a school district, why would we want to run it as a landlord? And so there are budget implications to which buildings and maybe additional buildings that could be closed. Good questions. We need to make sure but we keep in mind we have not made decisions and they have budget implications, both perhaps getting money into a pool upon which of money that we can draw upon for other things, or additional costs.
Thank you, Mr. Dorn. With that is currently 8:15, and with the sake of time, is there things that the board would like to see considered and added into the balancing act so that administration may work on it this week and get it prepared for us? Ms. Carol Hubbard, was that a hand? No? Okay. Mr. Dorn.
Okay, one major one is that I brought up, and we'll see whether there is support from other members to consider it, which, and I'd like to see where the administration has seen it. The custodial staffing, we have 3 custodial managers, which is the same we've had for several years. We're cutting the custodial staff approximately by 3/4. We are ostensibly would be hiring a company who knows what to do and should not need as much supervision. So I'm suggesting that we cut 2 positions there, because effectively the custodians primarily serving during the day in schools, they're supervised by the principal, and we don't need, and the company is supervising their staff. So I'm really that we've cut 2 positions in the custodial and those custodial supervisor positions. 2 of the 3.
Okay. May I ask a clarifying question, Mr. Doran, or maybe this is to administration? Would that be our daytime custodians that we have slated for the daytime spots at our schools, or what position is that?
I believe Mr. Doran's talking about custodial supervisors, and we have 2, not 3. And so I would also recommend to the board that you give us a dollar amount and we look at specific positions to reduce. I mean, that may very well likely be one of the positions we look at. But in the past, the board has, set a dollar amount, and then administration goes back and looks at specific positions to cut.
If I might follow up, then, yes, I looked specifically in there. There are 2 specific positions because there are 3 with custodial management. I see them outside the administrative cuts because it is such a clear connection and the dollar amounts are very clear there. So I can draw that because you've provided that money, the number. However, I can also say raise the cut to the administration, and so I don't really care where that goes, but those are 2 things.
I would email a dollar amount that you would like to see further cut to administration. That's what I would do, and go that route with it. I'd like to refrain from telling administration what positions. So email them a dollar amount.
I will
And
take that as a recommendation. Thank you.
we have Mrs. Hardy.
I'd like to throw my support behind other members who mentioned the Anchorage resolution. It was a resolution that was brought forward when they passed their budget at the same time for a $1,000 BSA increase. I don't think a $1,000 BSA increase does enough for us, so I would propose that ours is both a $1,000 BSA increase and a increase to transportation, at least to what we put out in our legislative priorities, so that we don't have to subsidize transportation. And the advantage of passing it at the same time is we don't get bogged down in the weeds about people wanting a rosier number. We can say, if it were 1,000, this is where I would put it. And I think everybody wants to put it towards PTR. And then it's not as bad, and it's basically throwing the ball to Juneau and saying, we've said this is what we do. If you fund it, this is what you're going to get. And that is a powerful advocacy tool. It's something people can use to call their legislators and say, nope, the school board, this is the budget they passed. And if it was this, this is what they're going to use it for. And I would be more willing to vote to pass a budget with more safe assumptions if at the same time we're passing something that clearly illustrates what it is we would do with more money.
Thank you for that, Mrs. Hardy. And with that, that makes a majority of the board who has spoken in favor of doing something like that. And so I would like to request maybe we set up 3 members, 2 to 3 members to work together on the resolution. Maybe we can bring it forward at our next work session. Just a suggestion of mine, not saying that's what we'll do. It's just an idea I have, Mr. Doran.
Might I suggest that in actual fact, we have multiple times, probably the majority of the times, at the end of the budget session have had what, especially when we've made cuts, which is the majority of the time, what our add back list is. Putting it in a formal resolution through our process, and I think last year worked quite well. We did have the add back list. We had and it was there, and it was actually part of our finished product. If we need to put it into a resolution format itself, that we just do it at that time. It's a real simple thing. We do a resolution for our budget, and we could just do it there rather than adding another procedural piece. And and it's something we've always done, and we've handed that list off. Putting it in a formal resolution is fine. That's what I would suggest. And
Okay, yeah,
Steve.
and that's yeah. Like I said, it was just a suggestion that I had, but that's a great one as well, and we can work on it together. Mrs. Hardy.
I will say that statewide advocacy groups are asking school districts to pass a formal resolution like Anchorage's to use in their advocacy efforts. It is a push around the state, and there's people contacting all the different districts so that they have it sets a clear message, and it seems to be coalescing around $1,000 BSA. I think it should be more than that, but that is, Anchorage leads the way in so many things and what it is, and us adding in transportation gives us some more assurances. To Mr. Doran's point, I agree, we've done it other ways. Making it formal makes it a talking point, and it becomes a communicable thing. The board voted, this is something we formally adopted, and says to every legislator, all you have to do is fund us, and we will lower PTR.
Mrs. Hardy, how would you suggest, seriously, your opinion, what would you think is the best way forward with this?
Anchorage just had 2 board members write it and do it as an amendment that the board voted on. We don't need a whole committee. We don't need things to become more complicated. We last year got in trouble for having multiple members and saying that, we broke OMA, which technically anything that's a subcommittee of the board is now under OMA. I'm happy to ride Anchorage's coattails. I had offered this to Dr. Meinert last week, and just write up using the template they've already given us, which is what we did for our entire board assembly resolution last year. Say, here's what it is, and here's what we can do, and then we can decide and tweak those numbers up there as far as how much PTR that gives us. It's not a whole lot. It's not as much as Anchorage is able to do with it. They have more students. $1,000 BSA goes a lot farther there than it does in Fairbanks with less students. But I don't think we have to make it complicated.
Would Mrs. Hardy, would you be willing to take this on and maybe choose a board member to help you, or if not, that's fine too?
I would not have us do more than 2,
'Kay.
given the OMA implications, and I
Perfect.
am happy to draft something up and then pass it on to a board member. I will shamelessly be copying mostly what Anchorage did.
Fantastic. That works. Thank you, Mrs. Hardy. Miss Dooley and then Miss Carol Hubbard.
Yeah, I think that we should move forward with that, and I would like to work with Mrs. Hardy on that.
Thank you, Mrs. Julian. I'll have her go ahead and get working on it, and if you could email it over, that'd be great. And then we'll bring it forward at our next work session. That'd be awesome. And we can get it agended tomorrow. So we'll get that worked on with the agenda. Miss Carol Hubbard?
I was going to offer to work with Mrs.
Okay.
Hardy. Never mind.
Okay, I will leave that to Mrs. Hardy to decide. I've put her in charge of doing the resolution. So Mrs. Hardy, you feel free to choose your board member and just make sure to bring it forward at our next work session, and we will have it agended tomorrow. Perfect. With that, the time is, Mr. Doran?
Okay, I'm confused, and I just wanted clarified to bring it to for future work session, but then you reference agenda tomorrow. It's not on tomorrow's agenda.
No,
Will
we're
not.
going to sit down and discuss putting it on the agenda tomorrow. That's what I mean, to put it on a future agenda.
Okay, and I would suggest that it's got to be done, it can be drafted, and I have no
I hear you,
problem
Mr.
doing a
Doran.
formal thing, but it can't be done until we're finished our
Okay, thank you, Mr. Doran. With that, it is 8:23. We're getting close to 8:30. We've had a few good things come forward for administration. Is there anything further from the board before we adjourn for the evening? Mr. Doran?
Just so I know, and I know that part of the answer is yes, because as we go through, there are things that we may come up with, and it's procedure, so we're all on the same plate. As we go through the budget, if there is something, even if there appears not to be on the surface a broad enough, whatever that is, support to get into balancing act, we can still bring those up and make amendments and such as we go through the process in a couple of weeks.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Okay, if something is not in the bottom line is if something is not in the
Yes.
balancing act, we'll all be in the position to make amendments as we go
Yes,
through,
at the
et
meetings,
cetera,
correct.
and have discussion.
Correct.
See what the breadth of
Yep.
support is.
Yep, and that was also a big reason for wanting to do the longer work session on the 17th as well, to be able to really, truly dig in and work through that. So we'll wait to hear back from a couple board members, but the consensus was we would go ahead and do that. Mr. DeGraw.
And just, it would be very helpful to administration to try to get those ideas in so that administration can cost those things out, especially if they're new items. If they're items that the board has already discussed, we'll probably have dollar amounts attached. But yeah, if they're new items, please send them to Dr. Minor and Ms. President Burnett.
Mr. Doran.
And we can cost them out.
Right. Could I suggest and see what the feeling is that as we do that, so like I sent in a list, I just got the responses today with dollar amounts to that. We probably are at the stage where those would be good to be sent to all board members,
Okay.
not to debate among, because we have to do that in public, but it will avoid our asking redundant questions perhaps, and we all have the same information on dollar estimates, et cetera.
I can go ahead and send your email out to the board with the answers to your question.
And I'm thinking again, if when the administration responds, and we have done this actually before, but the administration does it, they can just send it out. So it's the same thing, but it saves a step.
Got it.
So my suggestion.
Thank you, Mr. Doran. Anything else from the board at this time, Mr. Burgess?
Thank you. I'll just say that I support those comments made regarding the custodial supervisors and also the resolution for the add backs. I also agree with Mrs. Hardy that including transportation funding in our resolution may be a good idea. I'm going to suggest, however, that we show that there would be a difference between, show the differences if they only do one of the things, essentially. And other than that, I do want to just say, this is a highly emotional conversation around schools and reopening new schools, charters, as well as just the budget in general. And I went to an event this weekend. Went out in the public, and I just wanted to say, like, it was really great to hear from some community members who sympathize with the position that we're in here and are showing us that they support our decisions or understand those. That felt really good, and I want us all to remember that there are community members out there who do support the decisions that we make, or who, whether or not they agree with those decisions, they understand. And I would encourage the community, that those folks that are part of this community, to speak up publicly and let us know, because this is hard, and getting any bolstering that we can from the public is really helpful. We tend to hear those voices that are dissatisfied much more often than those who are understanding. So yeah, I just want to throw that out there to the listening public, because and to other board members, to remember to move forward, keeping in mind that we are not hearing all of the voices out there, but also to encourage folks to speak up. And let us know when they do support us or understand the decisions that we have to make, and to be kind to one another as well. So thank you. That's where I'll leave my thoughts for the evening.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. With that, we are now adjourned.